This session will focus on practical intelligence, the development of expertise in multiple intelligence. According to Tennant and Pogson, adult intelligence and cognitive development can be reconceptualized as comprising both practical intelligence and expertise. The next video we'll see a brief explanation about the IQ tests and the bias and origin of those. We'll look at that and then go to another slide after that and have further discussion.
IQ tests in America had been around only since 1910. So in that 7 or 8 year period, they had been quite successful. They were already used in courts of law. Doctors were already using them. They were used in, I would say, hundreds of schools and school districts by 1917, the beginning of the war. They weren't yet used by the military. So the psychologists knew, here's our chance to pitch them and use our IQ tests. And they did. The Army didn't really like them much, and they took it reluctantly. But one of the reasons they hesitated and forced psychologists to think about it was, you're going to test all of these recruits one-on-one as they come in through the tent flap, all the new recruits, which is how IQ tests were done. They still are part of the time.
I'm the psychologist, you're the examiner. This is the way it's got to be done.
It's way too inefficient.
Yeah.
And so that's why IQ tests are eventually about institutional efficiency, is because the psychologists start to figure out that we need a way of testing groups of people and doing it quickly and efficiently. And there was a guy named Frederick Kelly who happened to be the dean of the University of Kansas Education Department. And he came up with this novel testing technology method called the multiple choice question. And that was in about 1915, 1916.
Multiple choice question.
Sorry, multiple choice question. Thank you. And the psychologists had learned about it just before 1917. And so one of them, this guy, Lewis Terman from Stanford, when he showed up to the meetings in New Jersey in 1917, said, voila, this is the way we're going to test large groups of people. We're not going to do it one-on-one. And there was, again, debate about it. It didn't seem very scientific to them. It was, it wasn't going to work. Anyway, they had to adopt it, otherwise they wouldn't be part of the war effort. They adopted it, and it worked in the sense that psychologists gained entree, and it worked in the sense that after the war, boy, they could tout what they had putatively done to help the war effort, although it's proven that they didn't help the war effort at all. Yeah. But they helped themselves tremendously in their PR effort.
We look at our Western philosophical influences. Obviously, we come from a rich history from the primary Greek influencers, who obviously influenced the Romans and then the Renaissance and came into the period of the Enlightenment and the research institution that we borrowed from Germany, with the institutions beginning with Johns Hopkins University and therefore now coming into major research universities around the country. And we see that these influences have, from our cultural history, have influenced how we operate in our culture, even in modern times, even to today. Most of you in this course, because it's a graduate course, had to take a standardized test. Most of you probably took the GRE, the Graduate Record Exam. Most of these were developed in the early 1900s. Been numbers of studies been done on these, numerous, and been shown and proven of their bias. Obviously exposed with some recent studies. Their limits are presented in formal education settings only. And so therefore, the whole idea of a standardized test that everybody fits into one basket and therefore can be measured on their success path if they are going to be successful in higher education or not based on one simple test is fallacy. And so therefore, many institutions, including our own, value other mechanisms. Obviously, your life experience, your work history, your references, your grade point average as an undergrad, and if you've taken some graduate courses, obviously taking that in consideration. There are a number of variables and different things that will factor into your success in an institution of higher education. I'm sure many of you have heard the phrase, the I will, sometimes is important or more important than the IQ. If somebody really, really wants to and puts their mind to it, it's amazing what they can do. In education and training, then, we still see the outworkings of the ancient prejudice favoring the thinker over the doer. I think we can all relate to that and would agree with that. It's true even in our culture. Now, some of you maybe grown up in rural settings, I should say, and probably relate to hearing maybe one of your relatives or somebody, a neighbor or something, talk about the city folk or that guy that's got the books, or the book person, the bookworm. So in those isolated cases it would be, but the society in general really does value the thinker over the doer. We'll shift over into the area of intelligence, multiple intelligence, and we see that it's an ability or set of abilities that permits an individual to solve problems or fashion products of consequence in a particular setting, cultural setting. And so here we see that intelligence really is, in a lot of ways, geographical. For example, we lived in Papua New Guinea. They didn't have very many words for cars or roads or telephone, different types of phones or different types of electronics and things like that. But boy, they had 50 different names for a sweet potato and about 30 different names for a banana and different names for different types of jungle ropes that they used. So see that intelligence in a lot of ways is geographical and cultural. Here we see that all intelligent acts are potentially practical, and those practical activities that involve solving problems or creating products require at least one intelligence. Depending on the situation you find yourself in, you may be lacking one intelligence to be able to help you. For example, you may need to have somebody help you with cooking. Maybe that you need help with cutting firewood, or somebody to help you with building a house, or somebody working on your vehicle, or an IT person or a computer person could be able to come over and help you with your computer problems to set you up. Electrician, a teacher, somebody who can break things down and unpack it and be able to explain things. And so we see that in reality we need to value as a society all the levels of intelligence. And we haven't even considered recreational activities yet. Sporting events, entertainment, music, art, all these things all are contributing to our society. And so therefore we need to value all of the levels of intelligence that people have. The next slide that we're going to view will have a brief video of Gardner, and he will be talking about the theory of multiple intelligence. But he, along with Wallace, argued that intelligence should include practical intelligence. So as you watch the video on the next slide, we will then end the presentation with that video. Consider the question, do you agree with Wallace and Gardner's position on intelligence? Consider that and to think through that as you watch his presentation.
I began to work simultaneously with children, normal kids, gifted kids, kids with learning problems, and with brain damaged adults, people who were once fine, but who had a stroke or a tumor or a missile accident. And the more I spent working with these two populations, and it was important that I was seeing kids every day and brain damaged patients every day, the more I became convinced that kind of in a gut level that it was much too simple to say smart, average, dumb, that people could be very good in one thing, average in a second thing, and not very good in a third. That's an intuition which I'm sure has been had by millions of people over the years. I think I then did two things which were important academically. Number one, I set up a series of criteria to essentially define what the human faculties were. And then I decided, and I don't never remembered how it happened, but it was important to call these intelligences. Mm-hmm. If I'd written a book called 7 or 8 or 9 Talents, mm-hmm. and said people can have different kinds of talents, everybody mm-hmm. would say, what else is new? Because we know they're musicians, they're athletes, they're chess players, and so on. Right. But it was the notion of saying there are 8 or 9 faculties. What we usually call smart is a conjunction of language and logic, but it doesn't say anything about spatial ability, about musical ability, about the capacity to solve problems using your hands or your body, about understanding other people, understanding yourself, being able to make distinctions in the natural world. Those are different faculties. And I think what sealed the deal in 1980 was we could find some neurological evidence that the language abilities came from one part of the brain, musical abilities from a second, and so on. So in the early 80s, I promulgated the theory of multiple intelligences, often called MI theory. You're kind to say it's universally adopted. I would say it's universally fretted about.
This excerpt is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law, the leader of reform in legal education and a leader in multimedia education for the public. To view the full interview and for a full listing of MSL's programs, log on to mslaw.edu.